Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your Flip classroom and our continuing discussion of the rise of absolutism, right? Welcome back to your virtual classroom anyway. You know, the one because we don't have any water pressure at school. And that's what happens in Louisiana, apparently, is you just have a virtual day because of water mains. Like, I've never lived in a state where this occurred, but you know what? Not bad about it. I think that y'all always need like a nice little day to like kind of wake up a little late, do your assignments and stuff like that. I don't think it kills you, right? So like it doesn't hurt any of us. And so I'm going to spend the day actually making sure I get those tests graded and stuff like that, getting those finished up and getting them posted, right? So going into it though, okay, you have one nice long flip for this virtual assignment. Now look, check this out though, okay? You only have to do about half of it right now. And you can save the other half of it for homework if you would like. You only have to do enough to answer the focus questions that are actually attached to this virtual assignment, which is not much, okay? So now going into it, though, we are going to pick up right where the last flip left off, where we're talking about the growth of absolutism in Europe, okay? So we are now going to be moving into a time period in European history where monarchs are going to begin to grow their power exponentially, right? Just like that power graph thing I showed you in the last flip, which is a big reason why I love that last flip, because when I edited it and changed it and made all those animations, I got it just perfect. Like, chances are if I tried to record it again, it would be terrible and awful, right? So the thing about it, though, going into it, is we're now about to talk about the growth of that monarchical power. And when you begin to talk about the growth of monarchical power throughout European history, you always got to start in the 1500s. Now, we're going to bounce around a lot, okay? Just give y'all a heads up. We're going to try to move in order as we possibly can. We're going to bounce around a lot. And we're going to do this country by country, okay? So the very first one we're going to start off with is we're going to start off with talking about this place, the Holy Roman Empire, and Spain, because at the time, they were united under one family, right? One family controlled all of this, and they were ruled by one central figure, right? And that figure you've heard of before. You know this guy before. Everybody knows him. His name is none other than Charles V, right? Charles V is the same guy that is going to be the guy that leads the Diet of Worms, right? Who calls that meeting to get Martin Luther to stop what he's saying when he was like 20 years old. He's going to be when he actually comes to the power, he's going to be 19. And the thing that you need to understand about it is his family dynamic is a big reason why he was able to do that, right? And this is referencing back to one of those words that you started your warm-up off with yesterday when I wasn't in class. We're going to be talking a little bit about those things called marriages of convenience here in a second, okay? But Charles V, okay, is a very important figure because he begins to demonstrate that growth of monarchical power. Now, when we're talking about him, you always got to identify one big key important thing. His family, right? Like, so who he is, what family he's from. Families and power dynamics are a very big deal when you're studying European history, right? For example, you got the Medicis in Florence. You got the Tudors over in England. You got a lot of other figures, like later on, we'll talk about the Hohenzollerns, right? We'll talk about them. We'll talk about the, We'll talk about the Bourbons, or the Bourbons is what you would actually call them. Like, that's going to be going forward a little bit later. But the Habsburgs, though, are very important because at the time in the 1500s, they were the largest family and the most powerful family throughout all of Europe, okay? A very wealthy dynasty. And by the way, when you actually take this test, you'll see two different variant spellings of it. This is the English way with a P, and the German way is with a B, right? So it goes Habsburg in German, and in English it goes Hapsburg. Now the Habsburg family, how are they able to control just so much territory, right? Like when you're looking at how much area they controlled, like Charles V controlled Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, parts of Italy, and the Netherlands, and bits and pieces of Switzerland. And on top of all of that, if he controls Spain, that means that he controls all of the colonies that Spain has begun to create in North and South America as well. We believe, or a lot of historians believe, that this dude owned close to 20% of the world at the time when he came to power, right? How is it possible that this guy is going to do that? How is it possible that the nephew of Catherine of Aragon and the grandchild of Isabella and Ferdinand is going to actually have this much power and territory? Well, it all comes back to that concept, marriages of convenience, right? So underneath this, right, just next to it, like, because of marriages of convenience, right? Because when you look at the Habsburg family, they were good at this, right? They had a lot of princes, and they knew that there were a lot of princesses out there that controlled land, and they needed to pass it on to somebody. Because when we go back to European history dynamics, we have to understand that if a woman was the last one left on the throne or the last one left in a line of succession, and oftentimes in certain countries, for example, France, under their Salic law regime, they weren't allowed to actually inherit the throne or inherit power. So what do? You marry her off to some other like rich royal prince from some other family, but what ends up happening is he then usurps her territory and land. So like here goes the story, right, how it actually happened. His great-grandfather, okay, like so great-grandfather, Maximilian I, okay, is going to be a very, wait, no. Yeah, great-grandfather, yeah. So his great-grandfather, Maximilian I, is going to be the Holy Roman Emperor, right? He's an Austrian Habsburg because that's where the Habsburgs are originally from, is the country of Austria, right? Or the Kingdom of Austria at the time. So, like, he goes off and marries this woman named Mary of Burgundy, right? And Burgundy is the eastern region of France, and she was the last one left in her family line. He marries her, so now not only does he control the Holy Roman Empire, he also controls Burgundy, right? They have a son named Philip the Handsome. Philip the Handsome goes off and marries Isabella and Ferdinand's daughter, Joanna the Mad. And whenever they marry those two off, that means that now Philip the Handsome controls not only the Holy Roman Empire, not only the Kingdom of Burgundy, but now also Spain, right? And so whenever, of course, they have a child, Joanna the Mad and Philip the Handsome have a kid, that kid's name is Charles V, right? So, and Charles V is going to be the guy that now controls all of that land, right? Marriages of convenience are a very important thing. Now, the thing that we need to understand, though, about Charles as well is he's actually not a bad ruler, right? So, now going into it, he was a very big-time Catholic, right? And that's why it was such a tough thing when the Reformation started out underneath his reign. Inside the Holy Roman Empire, the Reformation began, right? Martin Luther spoke German. He lived in the Holy Roman Empire in a city called Wittenberg. He posted the 95 Theses, right? And so the thing about it, though, is later on, he is going to pass laws that allow Germans to pick their own religion. So Charles V even started the concept of religious tolerance in Europe when it came from a ruling perspective. So when we're looking at this, though, he was a decent leader. A lot of historians believe that he was a decent leader, but he just had no chance at being a great one because of the things working against him, right? You couldn't take any great leader and stick him in this situation and they'd be better, then they'd be fine, right? If you took Elizabeth I, who I think is one of the best monarchs in all of European history, and stuck her in Charles' situation, she'd struggle too, right? Because she wouldn't be able to pull it off. Because he just had no chance. Y'all, the Reformation blew up underneath his rule when he was in his 20s, right? He controlled way too much land. Like, everything in red right there belonged to him. That means that a 1 out of 5 chance of stepping in something he owned, right? And then also on top of everything else, he couldn't control the German princes to prevent the Reformation from continuing to spread. So it literally is going to drive him insane, right? It's going to drive him up a wall, and he's not going to be able to control the whole thing. He's going to have wars in this area, like trade disputes in this area, inflation going on in Spain, and he just can't control all that territory. So he makes some pretty bold choices on what he's going to do and how he's going to actually keep his family from imploding in on itself. And we'll talk about the rest of that in the rest of this flip, but go ahead and check that out. And then once you get about 5 more minutes into the flip after this, you can go ahead and stop, do those focus questions. If you want to wait for the rest for your homework or something like that, you're more than welcome. But I'll see y'all then. And so Charles is struggling so much to be that first absolutist of Europe while he rules over that and that and that and that and all this other stuff. It's just he can't do it. And so he snaps, right? He snaps and he's like, I can't do it anymore. I can't. He can't handle the pressure. And so he splits his family into 2 distinctive branches, right? He was like, I will not allow my offspring and I will not allow my children to inherit the problems that I could not control. So I will take my family, my massive Habsburg family, and I'm going to split it in half, right? So he splits it into 2 branches. He calls it the Austrian branch and the Spanish branch. That's why the Habsburg royal family seal, which is right here, it's a double-headed black eagle, has 2 heads on it because he split that family into 2 separate branches. The Spanish branch he passes over to his son named Philip II, and the Holy Roman Empire branch that includes the Austrians, or the Austrian branch, he gives to his brother, Ferdinand II. All right, so now the big thing about it though with it is you have to understand, it's wait a minute, so what does Charles do if he's giving half to Philip and half to Ferdinand? What's left for Charles? That's the thing. He abdicates, right? He abdicates the throne completely. And he's like, I'm tired. I can't do this anymore, y'all. I cannot be expected to rule over all this stuff. I am one man. And also he's going mentally insane. Now, so he ends up abdicating to a French monastery, right? So now a French monastery, he chooses to go there because monasteries are quiet, right? So because the monks have to take vows of labor and silence, so he decides to retire to this monastery so he can try to relax and be one with himself. But Charles has problems when he goes there. He's going mentally insane because actually, fun fact, Charles's mom's name was Joanna the Mad, right? So literally because she apparently had possibly bipolar disorder and had manic fits of or manic episodes different kinds of like mental health disabilities and things like that. And so this may have lingeringly actually affected Charles as well. But also on top of all of that, Charles is an alcoholic and he has gout, right? So like gout, also known as the prince's disease, is this like illness that you have in the joints of your body, right? So like, you know, like when you pop your like knuckles and stuff like that, those air bubbles that come out of that fluid that make that popping noise, gout is when that fluid comes out of your knuckles and out of your like actual like connective tissue, and it crystallizes, forming a very, very, very hard chunk, and it causes a lot of pain, right? So with that understanding, he retires, but he's suffering in his retirement, and he's drinking, and that makes your gout worse, right? And he ends up going insane, and so he becomes obsessed with his own death, right? So he becomes obsessed with his own death, and he starts like hanging clocks all over the walls of his room, and he starts looking at them all the time, and they all click at the exact same rate, and it's driving him mentally insane because he's obsessed with his own death, and he's like, I bet if I died, no one even would be upset. And so he fakes his own funeral. Like Charles V actually literally faked his own funeral, and then literally had people come in to like say like, oh, we're so sad that you died, Charles, we're so sad, while he was faking being dead like this inside of his coffin with sheer cloth over top of him. And so literally he was just listening to everything that everyone said at his fake funeral. And halfway through his funeral, he got so mad that everybody wasn't upset enough that he sat up out of his coffin and stormed off to his room and shut the door, right? So like, he's a very weird guy, Charles, right? He's a very, very interesting character. And he ends up dying a couple of years later due to like complications associated with his alcoholism and his gout, right? Now, the thing about it, though, also that you need to understand is that Charles's fits of rage and things like that might not have been 100% his fault. He might have also been genetically weak from the get-go, because his entire family before him and then after him would oftentimes go off and marry other family members, right? There was a heavy amount of incest in the Habsburg family. So much incest in the Habsburg family, in fact, that they actually had a distinct facial feature that you could recognize a Habsburg by just the way that they looked, right? And it was this thing called the Habsburg jaw, okay? Write that down. The Habsburg jaw is basically they would have an underbite like this, right? Their top teeth would go behind their bottom teeth, and that's how you always knew, oh, that's a Habsburg right there, because, like, you know, their parents were all cousins and stuff. So, like, and it got so bad that they kept passing on these recessive genes and these bad genes that literally they all had this huge problem like this. And so notice, remember, I said they split it into an Austrian branch and a Spanish branch. The very, very last Spanish king that was a Habsburg is this guy. His name is Carlos II. And Carlos II had such a bad underbite that he talked like this, and he like drooled all the time, and he didn't even say his first words until he was 8, and he didn't even walk until he was 4, right? So like Carlos II is a good example of this incest in the Habsburg family and why their Spanish branch died out so quickly, right? Now his death is going to lead to a massive war we'll talk about later on, called the War of Spanish Succession, right? So, and that actually leads to the very first coalitions of countries teaming up against Louis XIV, the guy that we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, the Habsburg family, as you can tell, though, as we're going forward, is going to be of massive importance. Charles V is going to be of massive importance. And we got to talk about one of those rulers that he passed rulership on to, right? So Charles V, like we said, split the family in half, right? But beep, like splits them in half, gives one half to Ferdinand II, his brother, and gives the other half to Philip II, his son. So we are now going to take some time to talk about Philip II. Philip II, his son, is very shy, very recluse, but is now going to be the king of Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, as well as one other country here in a little bit, right? So he takes over Portugal, and through a very certain kind of schemy little convenience-like thing, and he takes over Portugal and he becomes the richest man and richest ruler in the world. Because now, if you are the king of Spain, you have access to all this gold and silver coming in from North America and South America. And you have all of these spices coming in from India all the way around Africa. He also is basically in charge of most of like the slave shipments that are coming from off the west coast of Africa, which is disgusting. What the heck, Philip? Now, the big thing, though, on top of everything else, is that going forward, he wants to have another country. He looks back at his dad. He's like, my dad couldn't handle the pressure and ends up going insane and splits the family in half and retires to a monastery, has a fake funeral, all this other stuff. Philip, though, saw an opportunity. Now, remember, who is Philip related to? Philip is related through marriage to the English royal family, right? Because remember, Henry was married to his great aunt, Charles's aunt, his father's aunt, Catherine of Aragon, right? Catherine of Aragon and Henry had one child together, Mary Tudor. So what he decides to do is marry his cousin, Bloody Mary, right?
Philip actually went off and married Bloody Mary. Mary Tudor had a husband. That's not something that we talked about when we talked about the Reformation, but had a husband. It's this guy. His name is Philip II, right? Philip II, Mary's husband, becomes the king of England through this marriage. Now, here's the thing you got to understand, though. Jot this down. He is king by title only. Let me say it again. King by title only, okay? He is king by title only just due to the fact that England is a constitutional monarchy. They are not an absolute monarchy. They have a parliament that will prevent him from being a king even if Mary dies, right? Also, another thing you need to understand is that Philip just wanted the power and the growth, right? Because he actually did not like Mary at all. She was 37, he was 27. She found him handsome, he found her repulsive, right? So, like, they actually only ever, kind of existed in the same spaces a handful of times. He apparently cheated on her constantly, but she wanted to have kids with him so badly so they could install Catholic leaders onto the throne of England and prevent Elizabeth from ever inheriting the throne. It got so bad at one point, apparently, that Mary Tudor literally had a phantom pregnancy. Mary Tudor convinced herself at one point that she was pregnant and that she was going to have Philip's child, and then that child would become the next ruler of England, bringing England back to Catholicism permanently. But literally after months go by and there's no change in her condition because her menstrual cycle stopped, her stomach had swelled and things like that, and royal doctors were like, I'm sorry, Mary, but there's no child in there. And so heartbroken, she dies a couple of years later, right? And when she dies with no children after this phantom pregnancy, Philip loses the throne. Philip loses the throne, though, because remember, he's king in title only. And he tried to marry Elizabeth, okay? He tried to marry Elizabeth right after Mary, died, and she assumes the throne. And funny enough, he actually does support Elizabeth becoming the king of, England, or Queen of England as well. So really, really quick, let's review everything we've talked about so far. Yeah, so we talked about so far, Charles V, right? Make sure you know that. We talked about those Habsburgs. We talked about him splitting his family in half, retiring, giving half to Philip, giving half to his brother, and all that stuff. And then we spent most of this whole time talking about Philip II and his rise to prominence, right? How he marries Bloody Mary and how their whole relationship kind of bottoms out. Make sure you look over that stuff and study it again, okay? But now we're moving into his relationship with Elizabeth, okay? So picking up right where we left off, he ends up supporting Elizabeth, right? He supports Elizabeth's ascension to the throne, mainly for one giant reason. There's this woman that lives in Scotland, and her name is Mary, Queen of Scots. And he supports Elizabeth's rise to the throne because if Mary inherits the throne, he's going to be really upset about this because Mary is pro-France. So originally, Philip was very gung-ho about Elizabeth becoming the Queen of England. And he was like, hey, let's get married. And she says no. But what ends up blowing up in his face is that Elizabeth actually ends up allying with the Dutch. Now, y'all don't know this yet, but what's happening inside of Philip's kingdom is he's supposed to be the king of the Netherlands, and the Netherlands is revolting against him. The Netherlands is in the middle of this thing called the 80 Years' War. They're revolting against Philip to try and actually get as much power and dominance as they can so they can create their own East India Company and they can make their money and go into their golden age, right? So what ends up going down, though, is that instead of actually helping Philip destroy the Dutch, Elizabeth allied with the Dutch, right? Philip becomes furious by this. He becomes enraged because he's trying to keep the Dutch underneath his thumb, and he's now so mad that Elizabeth is allied with the Dutch that he decides he's going to do something that every leader shouldn't do, okay? For the rest of your existence, if any of you ever become, like a dictator of Europe, okay, there's two things you don't do, all right? One, you never invade Russia on land, okay? Just don't do it. Promise? Do not invade Russia, and especially not during the winter. Napoleon, Hitler, way to go, dum-dums. Now, also, another big thing you don't do, don't try to invade England via the water, all right? So never, ever try to launch a naval invasion of England because you'll always end up losing Napoleon and Philip, because the big event that ends up happening is Philip, enraged by Elizabeth's alliance with the Dutch, enraged by the fact that he's no longer the king of England, enraged by the fact that the Dutch are literally revolting against him, he decides to launch this thing called the Spanish Armada, which happens in 1588, and it's one of the most famous examples of history that has ever occurred in European history, period, right? The Spanish Armada is a pivotal turning point because the English seemed heavily outmatched, right? Now, to give you an understanding, the belligerents of this fight had kind of equal number of vessels, right? The Spanish showed up with over 130 ships. The English had close to that amount. Most of the English ships, though, were merchant vessels were outfitted with cannons, and they had about 30-something warships, right? But the Spanish had over 20 galleons, right? And this right here is a Spanish galleon. The Spanish galleons were far larger than English warships, and they each of them had close to 60 cannons mounted, 30 on one side, 30 on the other. So when a Spanish galleon pulled up next to you and they were about to have a naval engagement, they could let off 30 shots of a cannon at your boat, effectively probably sinking it, or at least wounding your vessel to the point to where it can't fight anymore. So nobody wanted to try and fight Spanish galleons in the water. Elizabeth is worried about this. Elizabeth is nervous about this entire thing. And so what ends up going forward, though, is that actually Elizabeth hires a pirate to help her out, right? And with a little bit of luck and this pirate's help, she ends up winning the Spanish Armada, okay? So the English are going to end up winning with the use of fire ships and, like I said, getting a little bit lucky. What ends up going down is that the English, or excuse me, Elizabeth, hires a pirate by the name of Sir Francis Drake. And Sir Francis Drake comes up with a plan. And he's like, okay, we're going to try and force the Spanish to go around us and keep going to the north towards Scotland and Ireland. We're going to lure them into some like small bays and things like that where our lighter, smaller, and more maneuverable ships can get around the big, bulky galleons and push them out, right? What a genius idea. What a great concept behind this entire thing. So smart, right? And then also on top of it, Sir Francis Drake comes up with another idea, and he says we're going to use these things called fire ships, right? Fire ships is where they took old, broken down English vessels and set them on fire and would launch them at the Spanish galleons to try and cause confusion and melee, right? And then on top of that, as the Spanish continued to try and go all the way around England, let me pull up a map really quick. So England map D maps, okay? So like I'll show you really, really fast. Okay, here we go. Images. There we go. Here we go. All right, so like if we're looking at this map right here of England real fast, you'll actually see exactly what I'm talking about. So what ended up happening is Philip's boats came in through this area right here, right through the English Channel. Sir Francis Drake lured them into this area, and since the Spanish galleons were so big, the English drafted around them on all sides and used those fire ships, and the Spanish had to turn and run, right? Now, while they were turning and running, they had a plan. They were like, oh, we're going to sail all the way around Scotland and come all the way around down this side, and we'll land in Ireland. Why did the Spanish want to land in Ireland? Because Ireland's Catholic. Spain is Catholic. They're like, okay, we'll recruit an army right here, and then we'll launch a land invasion directly this way. Problem is, though, is on the way around, their food started spoiling right here. They hit a massive set of storms on the backside of Scotland that sank half of the Spanish Armada. So they never even got the chance to land in Ireland. So defeated, they had to return to Spain. And Elizabeth, the Queen of England, one of the most intense rulers of all time, has defeated the largest naval presence in the world at the time. Look at Elizabeth go in her victory portrait while she's like, yeah, no big deal. I just destroyed that entire fleet because I'm awesome, right? So Elizabeth destroys them, and then because of that, the Spanish power begins to decline, right? Now, during Philip's reign, though, Spain was going through a golden age of art and literature, right? So just to understand, during this time period, before Spain loses the Spanish Armada and their power begins to decline pretty steadily during the 1600s, they were going through a massive, massive era of growth in art. You've got guys like Greco and Velázquez, who were very, very famous painters during this time period, who actually showed up and did a lot of very famous work in the Baroque art realm, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Now, the thing about it, like this, for example, is the death of Charles V. This is a portrait by Velázquez, and this right here, or no, that's by Greco, and this right here is by Velázquez. It's called Las Meninas, which is actually a very famous painting that we'll talk about a little bit later on in class as well. And then also, Cervantes was a very, very famous writer who wrote a book called Don Quixote, right? And in Don Quixote, it's this famous story about chivalry and about the process forward of chivalrous knights and all of these other things and romanticizing the Middle Ages. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on as well too, and how this entire thing is like a little old man charging in a windmill that he thinks is a giant, right? Now going forward though, Spain's power is steadily going to decline in the 1600s after the Spanish Armada. Now the Spanish Armada happened in 1588. And by the 1630s, Spain's power is in the toilet, right? So like, and a lot of that is because of inflation, the Spanish Inquisition, and the Dutch, right? So, like, now looking at these big ideas and these big causes, inflation's happening because their money is losing value, right? So Spanish currency is tremendously going down in value due to the excessive amount of gold and silver that is being brought in through the ports from the Americas. Now, some of you are like, wait a minute, if you have a lot more money, how can you have too much money? Well, the problem with this is because Spain had kind of devalued manual labor, and they had also ran a bunch of people out. And due to this entire thing, they bought a lot of foreign products, right? And since they bought so many foreign products, the gold that they're bringing in is being paid out to other countries in the form of imported goods, right? So on top of all of that, the Spanish Inquisition was really biting Philip in, like biting him back, right? The Spanish Inquisition was a program that was launched by his grandmother or great grandmother and great grandfather, the grandparents of Charles V, Isabella and Ferdinand. Isabella and Ferdinand launched this program called the Spanish Inquisition long before Philip was ever even alive, and this was to banish all non-Catholics from Spain, particularly Jewish people and particularly Muslim people. Now, the thing about it is that the Jewish and Muslim populations of Spain did certain trades and product making that many other people did not. For example, jewelry making, banking, law office, like being lawyers, doctors, and these other kinds of fields of work. And since they've now been banished out of Spain, this negatively affected their economy, sending people to further results of actually purchasing other things from different places. So this tanked their economy, and the Spanish Inquisition shows why you shouldn't be so rude to people of other religions, right? But also on top of everything else, the Dutch are heavily revolting against the Spanish. And since they're revolting against the Spanish with the help of the English, this caused massive Spanish debt. And that's a big reason why you don't hear about Spain as much anymore in the long run. But all of this stuff, as you can see, during the late 1600s, Europe is in a crisis. You're going to see things like the English Civil War, the Spanish Armada, the wars of religion. But the thing about it is we're going to now pivot, and when we get back into class, when I see y'all next time, we're going to start talking about the English Civil War and a bunch of other really, really cool stuff about that. I got a great story to tell y'all in class about an execution. It's absolutely wild, but I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a good one.